Something is buried under the red surface of Mars right now, and it has been sitting there for 3.5 billion years, waiting. Not a rock, not a crater, not a lava field, a beach. An actual ancient Martian beach with waves that once rolled in from a massive lake, carved the shoreline, and left their geological fingerprints in layers of sandstone that survived billions of years of planetary transformation. NASA's Perseverance rover found it. Scientists confirmed it in January 2026. And it is only the latest in a chain of discoveries so rapid, so consistent, and so undeniable that the scientific conversation about Mars has shifted completely. The planet we once described as a cold, dry, lifeless desert turns out to have been something else entirely. Something wet, something warm, something that, by every measure science currently has, could have supported life. And the evidence is not coming from one place, or one instrument, or one mission. It is coming from everywhere at once. Let us start with the question that has driven planetary science for decades. Why does Mars, a planet with no running rivers, no standing lakes, and no liquid water anywhere on its surface today, show signs of massive ancient water activity in almost every corner it has been explored? The answer, as it turns out, is not a mystery anymore. It is a confirmed geological history. Mars had water. Enormous quantities of it. It flowed in rivers, pooled in lakes, filled craters, soaked into the ground, and quite possibly filled an entire ocean basin in the northern hemisphere. The story of how scientists figured this out is one of the greatest detective investigations in the history of space exploration, and the most shocking chapters are being written right now. To understand how big this is, you need to understand how scientists study a planet they cannot physically visit. The answer is rovers, those extraordinary robotic machines that crawl across alien terrain on 6 wheels, drill into rocks, analyze samples, take millions of photographs, and send back data across hundreds of millions of kilometers of space. NASA has operated 4 successful rovers on Mars: Sojourner, Spirit, Opportunity, Curiosity, and Perseverance. Each one pushing the boundary of what we knew further than the last. China landed its Zhurong rover in 2021. Together, these machines have built a picture of ancient Mars that would have seemed like science fiction just 20 years ago. And in the past 2 years specifically, from 2024 through 2026, the discoveries have accelerated to a pace that scientists themselves have described as extraordinary. Start with Curiosity. That rover has been on Mars since 2012, patiently climbing the slopes of Mount Sharp inside Gale Crater, collecting data for over a decade. By 2025, it had reached a region that looked, from orbit, like a giant network of spiderwebs etched into the Martian surface. Scientists called these structures boxwork formations, low ridges between 1 and 2 meters tall, crisscrossing the terrain for miles in every direction. When Curiosity got close enough to examine them directly, what it found rewrote the timeline of Martian water activity. These ridges formed when ancient groundwater flowed through cracks in the bedrock billions of years ago, depositing minerals into those fractures. The minerals hardened the rock around the cracks. Over billions of years, wind eroded the softer surrounding material, leaving only the mineralized fracture lines standing as ridges. What you see on the surface today is a fossil record of an underground water system, frozen in stone. It is not just evidence that water existed on Mars. It is evidence that groundwater was flowing through Mars at elevations and at times that scientists did not expect. The water table on ancient Mars was higher than models had predicted, and it stayed active later in Martian history than anyone had assumed. That single finding changes everything about how long habitable conditions could have persisted on the red planet. But Curiosity was not finished. Scientists drilled into the boxwork ridges and analyzed the samples with X-ray instruments and a high-temperature oven on board the rover. They found clay minerals in the ridgetops and carbonate minerals in the hollows, confirming the water-driven formation process in chemical detail. Then, they used a special analytical technique called wet chemistry, reserved only for the most scientifically significant targets, which makes it easier to detect organic compounds, the carbon-based molecules that are essential building blocks for all life as we know it. The results from that analysis were still being processed and studied by scientists into early 2026. The question being asked was not simply whether water was there. The question being asked was whether that groundwater, flowing later than expected, at higher elevations than predicted, carrying minerals and organic precursors through Martian rock, could have sustained microbial life longer than the standard model suggested. And the early answer appears to be yes, it could have. Now move across the planet to Jezero Crater, where Perseverance has been operating since 2021. Jezero is a 45-kilometer-wide impact crater in the northern hemisphere of Mars, and it was chosen as a landing site for one specific reason. From orbit, it showed the unmistakable geological signature of an ancient river delta, a fan-shaped deposit of sediment exactly like the ones that form on Earth where rivers flow into larger bodies of water. If water was ever there, sediment would have settled to the bottom of the lake, and in that sediment, if life ever existed, it might have left chemical traces behind. That was the hypothesis. In 2026, after 5 years of exploration, Perseverance has turned the hypothesis into confirmed geological fact, layer by layer, discovery by discovery. In March 2025, using its ground-penetrating radar instrument called RIMFAX, Perseverance detected the buried remains of an ancient river delta buried up to 35 meters underground, while crossing 6 kilometers of terrain inside the crater. The radar revealed layered sediments and eroded surfaces stretching underground in a fan-shaped pattern consistent with a delta environment where a river entered a large body of water. Researchers estimated this buried delta dates to between 3.7 and 4.2 billion years ago. That is almost as old as Mars itself, meaning water was flowing and pooling in Jezero when the planet was geologically very young, when conditions across the inner solar system were still actively evolving. The delta buried beneath the current surface actually predates the more recently studied surface delta that scientists had already confirmed was there. 2 separate delta systems, separated in time, both preserved in the same crater, each one representing a distinct period when Mars was wet enough, warm enough, and stable enough for rivers to flow into standing lakes. Then in September 2025, a paper published in the journal Nature described a discovery that made scientists around the world stop mid-sentence. Perseverance had been exploring an ancient dried riverbed inside Jezero called Neretva Vallis when it found a rock. An arrowhead-shaped specimen about 3 feet long by 2 feet wide, partially buried in the dry riverbed sediment. Scientists named it Chayava Falls, after a waterfall in the Grand Canyon. When the rover's instruments examined the freshly drilled surface of this rock, they found organic molecules, the carbon-based chemistry that is the foundation of all life on Earth. And they found a pattern of mineral rings that scientists called leopard spots, dark and bright spots arranged in a distinctive pattern. On Earth, this kind of pattern in rocks is known to form through one of 2 mechanisms. It either forms through the living processes of microbes, which chemically alter the rock around them as they consume nutrients and produce waste, or it forms through chemical reactions that can provide energy for life, reactions that occur at the boundary between oxidizing and reducing environments, exactly the kind of chemical gradient that scientists consider a critical requirement for life to emerge. Perseverance's instruments could not find a convincing, non-biological explanation for how these patterns formed in this specific rock, in the specific configuration, in the specific geological context. The lead scientist on the paper, when asked to summarize the finding, said it directly: "This is the closest we have ever come to discovering ancient life on Mars." That statement was not made carelessly. It was made by researchers who spent over a year analyzing every possible alternative explanation, who published their findings in the most scrutinized scientific journal in the world, who subjected their conclusions to the full weight of peer review. The sample drilled from Chayava Falls is now sealed in one of Perseverance's sample tubes, waiting for retrieval. What it might contain, and what laboratory analysis on Earth could extract from it, is something that scientists have described as potentially the most consequential piece of rock ever collected in the history of planetary exploration. And it is sitting on Mars right now, in a tube, in a desert, on a planet 100 million kilometers away. Now go back to January 2026 and the discovery of the ancient Martian beach. An international team of researchers led by Imperial College London spent years analyzing the data Perseverance collected from a geological unit on the inner rim of Jezero crater called the Martian unit. Before Perseverance arrived, scientists could not agree on what this region was. Some thought it was sediment deposited along the edge of the ancient lake. Others thought it was volcanic rock that was later altered by water. When the rover spent nearly a year exploring this area in 2023 and 2024, collecting data at a level of detail no orbiting instrument could match, the answer turned out to be both, and something even more significant. The Martian unit contains stratified sandstones with rounded grains, indicating that waves from a vast lake eroded and reworked the local bedrock around 3.5 billion years ago, depositing sandy layers along the shoreline. The western portion of the unit is volcanic in origin. The eastern portion contains sedimentary evidence of liquid water interacting with the shoreline over extended periods, creating what researchers described as a geological bathtub ring, a distinct horizon marking where the ancient waterline once stood. For the first time, scientists had found the first definitive evidence of an ancient Martian shoreline, not inferred from satellite images, not suggested by topographic data, found on the ground, in the rock, by a rover that drove along the actual ancient beach of a lake that existed 3.5 billion years ago. The researchers also found that minerals present in the Martian unit require extremely specific conditions to form, conditions that include intense, prolonged rainfall over millions of years, not seasonal rain, not occasional precipitation, Sustained rainfall, the kind that implies a thick atmosphere, an active water cycle, and climatic conditions far more stable and far more hospitable to life than Mars was previously thought to have experienced for that long a period. The findings extended the timeline for potential habitability in Jezero crater significantly further back than previous estimates. Mars was not just briefly wet. It was wet, warm, and potentially life-supporting for much longer than scientists had allowed themselves to believe. The Chinese rover Zhurong, which operated in the Utopia Planitia region of Mars before going dormant in 2022, contributed its own piece to this picture. Utopia Planitia is the largest known impact basin in the entire solar system, and scientists have long suspected it was once an ancient ocean floor. Zhurong carried ground-penetrating radar that detected underground geological reflectors in the subsurface. Dozens of them, all sloping at angles between 6 and 20 degrees in the same direction, toward the lowlands. The team compared this pattern to buried beach formations found on Earth, including the Bay of Bengal shoreline, and found a striking structural match. Their conclusion was that between 10 and 35 meters below the current Martian surface lies a 1.3-kilometer wide section of ancient sloping terrain consistent with a coastal foreshore environment where waves shaped sediment layers over an extended period of time. Sand dunes and lava flows could not have produced this pattern because those would slope in multiple directions. Every single reflector pointed the same way, toward where an ancient ocean would have been. The scientists who published these findings were careful in their language, but direct in their conclusion. This is the strongest on-the-ground evidence yet obtained for the former existence of an ancient ocean on Mars. And then, in July 2026, came a finding from data collected 20 years earlier. A researcher at Edith Cowan University reanalyzed soil measurements that NASA's Spirit rover took across 32 different locations inside Gusev crater, collected during the early 2000s. Hidden in that old data set, overlooked for 2 decades, was a widespread, low-level signal of crystalline hematite and altered magnetite, minerals that form when rocks interact with liquid water. This signal was not concentrated in one spot. It was distributed across every single site Spirit had examined. The implication is that an extensive, widespread layer of ancient water-rock interaction covered the floor of Gusev crater in a geologically uniform way, consistent with what scientists would expect from a region that was once broadly flooded. Not just a small pond, not just a single riverbed, a large-scale water presence that touched almost every corner of that ancient crater. Add all of this together, and what you have is not a collection of isolated discoveries. You have a coherent, planet-wide story coming in from different rovers, different instruments, different scientific teams, different regions of Mars, all arriving at the same conclusion. Mars had rivers, Mars had lakes, Mars had oceans, Mars had rain, Mars had groundwater flowing underground at depths and at timescales that scientists are still working to fully map. And underneath all of that water history, in the rocks and sediments it left behind, something else may have been happening. Chemistry. The complex, organized, self-perpetuating chemistry that, on Earth, we call life. The question of whether any of that chemistry actually crossed the threshold into living organisms on Mars cannot yet be answered. The Chiava Falls sample, which NASA described in September 2025 as containing the clearest potential biosignature ever identified on the planet, needs to be brought back to Earth and analyzed in laboratories with instruments that no rover can carry. The Mars Sample Return Mission was designed to do exactly that. Perseverance has spent years carefully drilling, sealing, and storing rock cores for that purpose. But the funding for that mission was cut from NASA's budget in early 2026, leaving those samples stranded on Mars, sealed in their tubes, waiting for a retrieval mission that no longer has a confirmed launch date. The most scientifically valuable rocks ever collected on another planet are sitting on a frozen desert world, and the mission to bring them home is currently without a clear path forward. That situation is not where the story ends. Humans are scheduled to reach Mars in the 2030s. When they arrive, they will not be landing on a dead, dry, unremarkable planet. They will be landing on a world with a confirmed history of oceans, rivers, lakes, beaches, groundwater systems, and organic chemistry. They will be landing in places where 3.5 billion years ago, waves broke on a shoreline and water soaked through rocks, carrying minerals and carbon-based molecules that, under the right conditions, could have assembled into something alive. Whether that assembly ever happened is still the open question. But every single discovery made by the rovers in the past 2 years has pushed the conditions required for that question to have a yes answer further and further into the range of scientific possibility. Mars was not always the frozen desert it is today. The planet we see now is not the planet that existed for the first billion years of its life. Something changed. The atmosphere thinned, the magnetic field weakened, the liquid water froze or escaped into space or sank deep into the crust, where NASA's InSight lander found evidence in 2024 that large volumes of it may still exist today, trapped in rock layers 3 miles underground. The transformation of Mars from a potentially habitable wet world to the cold, empty landscape of today is one of the most important planetary science questions of our era, not just because it tells us what happened on Mars, but because it may tell us something about what could happen to any planet, including our own, under the right combination of circumstances. The rovers are still there. Curiosity is still climbing. Perseverance is still driving, still drilling, still sealing samples into tubes and waiting for the day those tubes come home. The ancient beach is still there, its sandstone layers still sloping toward where the water used to be. Chayava Falls, with its leopard spots and its organic molecules, is still sitting in a sample tube on the floor of a dry riverbed that once carried water from a living landscape to a living lake. The evidence is in. The verdict is clear on the question of water. And the next question, the one that matters most, the one that scientists have pointed everything toward for 60 years of Mars exploration, that question still does not have its final answer. But it has never been closer to one than it is right now.